She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stood there in that glittering ballroom while her husband pulled the Donna Necklace, the most sacred symbol of mafia authority in all of America, from around her neck and clasped it around his mistress instead. Every camera in the room caught Vivian Cross smiling like she'd already won. What they didn't catch was the quiet way Seraphine Vale Moretti's eyes moved across the room, reading every face, every stillness, every carefully controlled expression. Not a single Don stepped forward to bow. Not one patriarch raised his glass. The applause came from Damien's paid men. The silence came from everyone who actually mattered. If you were standing in Seraphine's shoes right now, your husband's betrayal playing out in front of hundreds of witnesses, your entire world stripped from you in one theatrical gesture, what would you do? Before we go any further, if you're new here, please subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. You will not want to miss what comes next. And drop a like, then leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The Romano Syndicate's annual council gala had always been held at the Veltrano estate, a property so old the marble floors had developed their own particular echo, the kind that made every footstep sound like a verdict. 12 chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling. The guest list ran to 300, and every name on it carried weight that couldn't be measured in ordinary terms. Crime families from 8 states, international allies from 4 continents, men who had built fortunes from silence and fear, dressed tonight in their finest because this was the one gathering each year where the rules demanded civility, regardless of what burned underneath. Seraphine had attended every single one of these events for 19 years. She knew the room the way a surgeon knows a patient, where the pressure points were, which alliances ran shallow and which ran bone deep, whose handshake meant something and whose was theater. She had spent nearly 2 decades learning this world, not because Damien had taught her, but because nobody had, and she'd had to figure it out herself or drown. Tonight she wore navy, simple cut. No jewelry beyond the Donna necklace, which had rested against her collarbone since the day she married into the Moretti line. She hadn't thought about it when she got dressed. It was simply part of her, the way her name was part of her, something that just was. She was standing near the East Bar talking to Elena Caruso, the quietly formidable wife of Don Marcus Caruso, whose territory covered most of the Mid-Atlantic corridor, when she heard the music stop. That was the first signal. The orchestra didn't stop for applause. It didn't stop for speeches. The only reason it ever stopped mid-song was if Damien wanted the room's full attention. Seraphine set down her glass. She turned slowly because she already understood that whatever came next was going to require her to not flinch. Damien was standing at the center of the room. He'd chosen his spot carefully, the natural focal point between the 2 largest chandeliers, the place where the light hit best, where every person in the room could see him without repositioning themselves. He'd always had a theatrical instinct, her husband. She'd found it charming once. Vivienne Cross stood beside him, blonde, 41 years old, though her team worked hard to suggest 35. She was wearing scarlet, obviously deliberate, and smiling the way people smile when they've been rehearsing for a very long time and the curtain has finally gone up. Seraphine had known about Vivienne for 14 months. She had documentation on the affair going back to its first week. She had not confronted Damien because confrontation, in her experience, only gave the other side information about what you knew and when you'd found out. She had waited, instead. Watched. Mapped the thing. What she had not anticipated, what she would admit to herself later, alone, was a genuine failure of imagination, was that Damien would do this here. He reached up. His hands found the clasp at the back of her neck before she fully registered he was behind her. The Donna necklace lifted away. She felt its absence as a cold stripe against her collarbone. She did not move. He walked to Vivienne and placed it around the mistress's neck with the practiced reverence of a man who had scripted this moment down to the gesture. The room made noise, not the full sound of genuine approval, but the specific noise of people who work for you performing enthusiasm on command. Cameras flashed. Someone called out a congratulation. Seraphine looked at the room. She looked at Don Marcus Caruso, who was 73 years old and had buried 2 of his own sons to keep his alliance with the Moretti line intact. His face was stone. His glass had not moved. She looked at Augusto Ferrante, the patriarch of the Ferrante family, who controlled shipping on the entire Gulf Coast. He was watching Vivian with an expression that wasn't hostility so much as clinical detachment, the way a doctor looks at a symptom. She looked at Benedetto Sanz, the oldest man in the room, who had been at her father's side when the original covenant between the families was signed 41 years ago. He was 88 years old and had not bowed his head to another living soul in decades. He was looking directly at Seraphine, not at the necklace on Vivian's throat, at her. She gave him the smallest possible nod, so small that anyone watching from more than 6 feet away would have missed it. His expression shifted, not into warmth exactly, but into something that looked like the resolution of a question he'd already known the answer to. Damien was speaking. She could hear him but wasn't tracking the words closely. Something about a new era. Something about evolution. The kind of speech that sounds like it was written by someone who has never personally experienced consequences. Vivian's hand found his arm. She was already leaning into the role, angling herself toward the photographers, letting the light catch the Donna necklace. She had no idea what the necklace actually was. That was apparent. She thought it was jewelry. She thought it was a symbol of Damien's approval, a trophy, a crown that a man could grant to whichever woman he chose. She didn't know the necklace's history. She didn't know who had made it, or why, or what covenant it represented. She didn't know that it had been created not as an ornament, but as a seal, a physical token of the agreement that had first united the American Mafia families under a single architecture of loyalty, decades before most of the men in this room were born. She didn't know the woman who had negotiated that agreement. She didn't know that woman's family name, Seraphine's family name, Vale, the House of Valsieri, in its American translation. A bloodline that had not ruled through force, but through something rarer and more durable, through the specific genius of making warring men trust each other. Her grandmother had done it first. Her mother had maintained it. And Seraphine had inherited not just the bloodline, but the method, patience, precision, and the understanding that genuine loyalty was built slowly and could not be manufactured by spectacle. The music came back. The crowd redistributed itself. Vivienne began working the room on Damien's arm, and Seraphine watched how people received her. Politely. Correctly. With the exact degree of surface warmth that experienced men offer to someone they consider irrelevant but don't want to antagonize. Nobody stepped aside for her. Nobody leaned in when she spoke. Nobody's posture changed. Seraphine had spent 19 years learning to read the microlanguage of this world. And what she read tonight was unambiguous. The room did not recognize Vivienne Cross as anything. The necklace on her throat might as well have been paste. This was information. Seraphine filed it. She spent the next 40 minutes moving through the gala in her usual pattern, unhurried, attentive, stopping to speak with each Don and their representatives in turn. She didn't mention the incident at the center of the room. She didn't need to. These men had seen it. They had their own opinions. What they needed from her tonight was confirmation that she remained steady, that the ground hadn't shifted under the thing they had long relied on. She gave them that without theatrics. She talked with Marcus Caruso about his granddaughter, who had just been accepted to a medical program in Philadelphia. She talked with Augusto Ferrante about a shipping dispute that had been quietly festering for 3 months, offered him 2 concrete suggestions, both of which he accepted with visible relief, because they were good suggestions, and he knew it. She sat for 12 minutes with Benedetto Sanz and didn't say much at all. The old man mostly wanted to look at her. She let him. He squeezed her hand when she stood to leave. "Your mother," he said, and didn't finish the sentence. "I know," she said. That was enough. Later, near midnight, she found herself standing near the garden entrance when Damien appeared at her elbow. The crowd had thinned. Vivienne was somewhere inside, holding court with a group of younger associates who didn't know enough to know what deference she wasn't receiving from the people who mattered. Damien looked at Seraphine the way he'd been looking at her for the last 2 years, with a guilt he hadn't yet processed into behavior change, wrapped in a defensive irritation that let him feel like the injured party. "You're handling this well," he said. It wasn't a compliment. It was a probe. He wanted to know how angry she was. "Am I?" she said. "No scene. No tears." He paused. "I expected something." "I know you did." He frowned. "Seraphine, it's a long night, Damien," she said. "We don't have to do this now. I need you to understand that this wasn't about you being... I understand what it was about," she said, and her voice was completely level. Not cold exactly. More like a room where all the windows are closed. You believed a story someone told you about me, and you chose to believe it without asking me whether it was true. And then you made a decision that you thought was irreversible in front of 300 people because you thought irreversible would mean I couldn't argue back. He was quiet for a moment. Vivian is... I know what Vivian is, Seraphine said. I've known for over a year. That landed. She watched it land. You... He stopped, started again. If you knew, why didn't you... Because I was watching, she said. I wanted to understand the full shape of it before I did anything about it. He stared at her. She could see the discomfort moving through him. The specific discomfort of a man who has just realized that what he thought was his decision was actually something he was guided into. What does that mean? He said. She looked past him toward the interior of the estate, where the last knot of guests was dissolving toward coats and cars. It means, she said, that the necklace was never the thing. She left him standing there. She walked back through the ballroom, past the staff who were already clearing glasses, past the places on the floor where 300 people had stood, and witnessed something that Damien believed was his moment of power, and she had already begun to understand differently. She stopped near the empty orchestra platform. Across the room, partially obscured by a column, one of Damien's oldest capo, a man named Tavio, who had been with the Moretti organization for 30 years and answered to nobody but the boss, was standing very still. He was watching her. When her eyes found his, he gave her a small, deliberate nod. Not a greeting, something more structural than that. She nodded back. She collected her coat. She said the right things to the staff on her way out. She sat in the back of the car with her hands folded in her lap and watched the city lights move past the window, and she thought, as she often thought in moments like this, about her grandmother. The old woman had told her something once. Seraphine had been maybe 14, and she hadn't fully understood it at the time, but it had stayed with her the way certain things do, lodged somewhere deep, waiting for the circumstances that would make it make sense. Real power, her grandmother had said, doesn't announce itself. It just is. And the people who know it, know it. And the people who don't, well, they'll learn. She'd been thinking about a necklace at 14, about ceremony and symbols and the pretty logic of things that could be seen. She understood now what her grandmother had actually been talking about. The car moved through the dark city. Seraphine didn't sleep. She was already thinking about what came next, running through the variables, mapping the landscape of the thing the way she always had, not from fear, but from the same fundamental instinct that had defined every woman in her line before her. You see the board before you move, and she had seen it, every piece, every pressure point, every debt that was owed and every loyalty that hadn't been bought but earned over years through the kind of consistent presence and steady judgment that doesn't photograph well but turns out to be, in the end, the only thing that holds anything together when the beautiful surface finally cracks. She pressed her fingers against the bare skin at her collarbone where the necklace had rested for 19 years. She wasn't angry about the necklace. She was thinking about the black table, the gathering that came in 6 weeks, where every family renewed its allegiances, where the real architecture of the world she lived in was either confirmed or shaken loose, where Damien intended to arrive with Vivian on his arm and the expectation of universal submission, where everything, she understood now with complete clarity, was going to change. She let out a long, slow breath. Outside the window, the city continued its indifferent business, its lights, its noise, its 10,000 private dramas playing out behind locked doors. She watched it pass. She let herself feel, for exactly 30 seconds, the full weight of what Damien had done tonight. The humiliation of it. The grief underneath the humiliation. Because whatever he had become, she had loved him once, and that wasn't nothing, and she wasn't the kind of woman who pretended it was. Then the 30 seconds ended. She straightened. She began to plan. The morning after the gala, Seraphine woke at 5:15 without an alarm. She lay still for 2 minutes in the dark, listening to the house. The Moretti estate was never fully quiet. There were always guards cycling through their rotations, the distant creak of the old buildings settling into the cold, the particular silence of rooms that held secrets. She had learned to read this house the way sailors read water. She knew the difference between its ordinary nighttime sounds and something wrong. This morning it was ordinary. She got up. Damien had not come home. She noticed this the way she noticed weather, as information, not injury. His absence told her he'd stayed with Vivian, which meant he was either building confidence or receiving instructions. Possibly both. She filed it and moved on. She made her own coffee in the kitchen, which she preferred to do because the kitchen at 5 in the morning was the one place in this entire estate where nobody watched her. The staff wouldn't arrive until 7. The overnight guards stayed to their posts near the exterior. For 90 minutes, she had something that almost resembled privacy. She stood at the counter with her cup and went through everything she knew. Vivian Cross had entered Damien's orbit 22 months ago through a charity event in New York, a fundraiser for a hospital foundation that Vivian ran, or appeared to run. Seraphine had run the name within the first week and found nothing obviously alarming, which itself was mildly alarming, because people without obvious alarm bells in this world were either genuinely clean or extraordinarily careful. Vivian, it turned out, was the latter. Her actual history was buried under 3 layers of shell identities. It had taken Seraphine's contact, a forensic researcher named Iris, who owed her a debt from 8 years ago and was meticulous to the point of obsession, 4 months to excavate the real architecture of Vivian Cross. What Iris had found was a woman who had spent 15 years moving through the edges of organized crime in Europe and South America, never as a principal, always as an adjacent figure, a facilitator, someone who attached herself to powerful men and found ways to make herself essential to them while remaining officially uninvolved in anything that could be prosecuted. Vivian was not improvising. She never had been. Seraphine drank her coffee and thought about timing. The black table was 6 weeks out. That wasn't an accident. Whoever was directing Vivian, because Seraphine had become increasingly certain that Vivian was directed, not autonomous, had planned around that window. The gala humiliation had been designed to fracture Seraphine's standing before the most critical gathering in the Mafia calendar. Arrive at the black table with Vivian wearing the Donna necklace and Seraphine visibly sidelined, and you had a shot at resetting the power architecture of every family alliance simultaneously. It was, she admitted to herself, not a stupid plan. It assumed, however, that the necklace was the source of her authority. That was the plan's foundational error. A mistake that could only be made by someone who had studied the surface of this world without understanding its interior. The Donna necklace was a symbol. Her authority was not. The front door opened at 7:43. She heard Damien's footsteps in the entry hall. That particular cadence she'd memorized 2 decades ago, slightly heavier on the left foot, deliberate in the way of a man who doesn't want to seem like he's trying to be quiet. He was carrying guilt somewhere in his body, she could tell from across the house. Guilt made people walk differently. He came into the kitchen. I was still wearing last night's suit. He hadn't slept. His eyes were doing the thing they did when he was trying to decide whether to be defensive or apologetic, and landing somewhere uneasily between the two. "You're up early," he said. "I'm always up early," she said. "Coffee's made." He poured himself a cup, stood on the opposite side of the island. She let the silence run, not as a tactic, just because she had nothing particular she needed to say yet, and she'd learned long ago that silence made people fill space in revealing ways. "I've been thinking," he said, about what you said last night, that you'd been watching." He set the cup down. "What did you mean you were watching?" "I meant what I said." "Seraphine." His voice had an edge now, not anger exactly, something closer to unease dressed up as authority. "I need you to be straight with me." She looked at him. "I know about Vivian's background." He blinked. "Not the background she showed you," she said, "the one underneath it. She has a history in European syndicate work going back 15 years. She's been placed, Damien. Someone put her in your path." He was quiet for 3 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than he'd normally take to dismiss something. That small pause told her everything about how destabilized he already was, underneath last night's performance. He started, stopped. "That's a serious accusation." "It's not an accusation. It's a finding." She reached into the pocket of her robe and set a folded document on the counter between them. 3 pages. Iris's summary, stripped of identifying details about the source. He didn't pick it up immediately. He looked at it the way people look at things. "They're afraid we'll confirm what they've already started suspecting." "Where did you get this?" he said. "Does that matter more than what's in it?" "Seraphine, pick it up, Damien." He picked it up. She watched him read. Watched the small muscles around his jaw tighten on the second page. Watched his thumb press harder into the paper as he got to the section on Vivian's known associates. 3 names that would mean nothing to a civilian and everything to someone who'd spent 30 years in organized crime. He set the pages down. This could be fabricated, he said. She'd expected that. It could be, she said. You'd have to decide whether the woman handing you information about your mistress or the mistress herself is more likely to be fabricating things. I'll leave that judgment to you. You're saying she manipulated me. I'm saying someone did. He didn't like that. His chin came up. I'm not someone who everybody gets manipulated by the right person using the right approach, she said, and kept her voice entirely neutral. That's not weakness. The people who can't be manipulated at all are the ones with nothing they care about. You cared about feeling underestimated. Someone noticed that and built around it. The kitchen was very quiet. Damien looked at the pages on the counter, looked at his coffee, looked at some middle distance that existed only in his own head. I need to think, he said. I know. This doesn't mean... He stopped again. Last night doesn't just... Damien, she said. I'm not asking for anything right now. I'm giving you information because regardless of everything else, your life and this organization are in danger. What you do with that is your business. She picked up her cup and walked out of the kitchen. She gave him the morning to sit with it. By 10 o'clock, she was in the East Study, working through correspondence, when Tavio appeared in the doorway. He was a compact man, 56 years old, with the patient, unhurried manner of someone who has never once made a decision in haste and plans to maintain that record. He had been with the Moretti organization since before Damien took over from his father. His loyalty to the organization ran deeper than his loyalty to any individual in it, which was exactly why Seraphine had always trusted him more than most. Mrs. Moretti, he said. Close the door, she said. He did. He sat in the chair across from her desk without being invited, the comfortable assumption of a man who'd sat in that chair many times before. The Ferrante people called this morning, he said. Augusto wants a meeting. When? He said whenever works for you, not for the boss. For you. She noted that. Set it for tomorrow. The restaurant on Meridian, the private room in back. Done. He paused. Caruso reached out also. His son Luca, actually, not Marcus. Luca said his father wants to know if the arrangement still stands. Tell Luca to tell Marcus that the arrangement has never not stood, and that I'd like to speak with him directly, at his convenience. Tavio nodded. There's something else. He reached into his jacket and set a small device on the desk, a USB drive. Declan found this in the South Conference Room, plugged into the secondary router behind the credenza. She looked at it without touching it. Who put it there, she said. We think the access was 2 weeks ago, during the budget meeting. He paused. The only new person in that room was one of Vivian's assistants, a man named Paul Stern. He was there to take notes. Seraphine was quiet. 2 weeks, she said. At least. Which meant they'd been listening to internal Moretti operations for a minimum of 14 days. Financial discussions, personnel decisions, alliance conversations. Anything discussed in that room, and a great deal was discussed in that room, was potentially compromised. Does Damien know about this yet? She said. No. She considered that. Tell him. Today. Don't wait. Tavio nodded. There's more. Declan pulled the entry logs for the past month. He folded his hands on the table. Stern was in 3 other rooms we didn't know about. She kept her expression still. The external comm room, she said. Not a question. Yes. The external comm room was where the encrypted lines ran, where communications with every allied family were routed. If those lines had been monitored for 2 weeks, every conversation between Damien and the other Dons, including anything said about the Black Table, was in someone else's hands. All right, she said. Tavio waited. Get Declan to pull all communications logs for the past 30 days. I want to know exactly what was transmitted and when. Run it against our meeting schedules. She paused. And find Paul Stern. He left the estate 4 days ago. Officially, he went back to New York with Vivian's team. We're running the address. He won't be at the address, she said. No, Tavio agreed. Probably not. After he left, she sat for a long time without moving. The operation was more sophisticated than she'd initially read it. A listening operation running for weeks inside the estate's own walls that required planning, resources, and inside knowledge of the building's layout. Vivian hadn't just been working on Damien, she'd been running a full intelligence operation under the cover of a romantic entanglement, and she'd had help that knew exactly how the Moretti estate functioned, which meant someone with access to that knowledge was on Vivian's side. Seraphine started building the list. She was on the third page of notes when her phone rang. The number belonged to a woman named Corinne Slade, who ran a small art advisory firm in Chicago, and who was, in the world outside this one, entirely unremarkable. In the world Seraphine actually inhabited, Corinne was one of 3 people she trusted with no qualification at all. She picked up. "I was going to call you today." "I know," Corinne said. "I saw the coverage from last night. 3 different sources forwarded me the photos." A pause. "You look calm in all of them." "I was calm." "I know you were. That's what concerns me." Corinne's voice was dry and precise. A woman who had spent 20 years navigating the financial infrastructure of organized crime and had developed an almost clinical ability to state unpleasant things without apology. "The Crosswoman has a connection to the Castellan Group." Seraphine's pen stopped. The Castellan Group was not a name spoken casually. It was an international syndicate, technically a private investment firm. Functionally, a criminal organization that operated across 12 countries and had spent the last 8 years systematically attempting to establish footholds in American organized crime territory. Every major family had rebuffed them at various points. The Castellan Group had not taken those rebuffs quietly. "How solid?" Seraphine said. "Bank solid." Corinne said, "I ran the financial threads on Cross's foundation. 3 layers in, the funding traces back to a holding company in Luxembourg that the Castellan Group uses for European operations. It's been there since the foundation launched." Another pause. 4 years ago, Seraphine. She was placed 4 years ago." 4 years. Damien had met Vivian 2 years ago, but the groundwork had been laid 4 years before the gala, before the affair, before any of it. Someone had been planning this for a very long time. "They're trying to get to the black table," Seraphine said. "More than get to it. I think they want to use it to detonate the alliance structure entirely, fracture the families, move into the vacuum." Corinne's voice was very level. "Vivian is the match. Damien is the fuel. You're the firewall they needed to remove before they could strike." Seraphine thought about the Donna necklace settling around Vivian's throat. Thought about all those cameras catching the moment. Thought about what those images would look like circulating through the families before the black table. Not humiliation. A signal, meant to read, to everyone who knew how to read it, as the Moretti family formally abandoning its covenant with the allied families. A unilateral move. A declaration of independence from the architecture that had kept the peace for 40 years. It would create exactly the kind of instability the Castellan Group needed. She leaned back in her chair. "Who inside the estate?" "I don't have a name yet, but the level of access they had, the layout knowledge, the comm room, it's not someone recent. It's somebody who's been here long enough to know the bones of the place." Long enough. She ran the calculation fast. 40 possible names. She could cut it by half based on access, cut it again based on motive. She'd have a short list by tonight. "Keep working the financial threads," she said. "I want everything you can get on Castellan's movement in the past 6 months." "Already on it." A beat. "Seraphine, be careful with Damien right now. Now, the document you gave him. If Vivian gets to him before he's had time to process it." "I know," she said. "She'll tell him you fabricated it. She'll tell him you've been running a shadow operation against him inside his own marriage. She'll make it about your ambition, not her manipulation." Corinne paused. "And some part of him will want to believe her because believing her is easier than believing he was played for 2 years." "I know," Seraphine said again. She hung up and sat with the quiet. Corinne was right. The next 48 hours with Damien were going to be the most delicate navigation of the entire situation. She needed him destabilized enough to question Vivian, but not so destabilized that Vivian could flip his paranoia back towards Seraphine. It was an extremely narrow ledge. She was still working through the geometry of it when she heard raised voices from the direction of the main hall. She recognized Damien's voice immediately. The other one took her a moment, and when she placed it, she was already moving. It was Vivian. She was in the house. Seraphine walked into the hall and found them standing near the base of the staircase, Damien with the pages from Iris's document crumpled slightly in one hand, Vivian reading the room with those quick assessing eyes, her expression calibrated precisely between wounded and outraged. Seraphine, Damien said, and his voice was doing the thing again, trying to position itself between two versions of the same story and failing to land cleanly on either. Vivian looked at her. "This is your work," she said. "This document." "Good morning," Seraphine said. "This is fabricated." Vivian's voice was controlled, but something underneath it had heat. "This is a woman desperate to hold on to a position she's already lost, and she's willing to damage this organization, this family, to do it." "Is it fabricated?" Seraphine said. "Not challenging, curious." "You know it is." "The Luxembourg Holding Company in the second-to-last paragraph," Seraphine said. "Is that fabricated? The name Paul Stern, who was in 4 rooms in this estate he shouldn't have been in, is that fabricated? Because Mr. Stern left a listening device in our comm room. We found it this morning. And unless I planted it myself at some point in the past 2 weeks, it seems like the information in that document is more solid than you'd prefer." Something moved across Vivian's face. Fast. Too fast for most people to catch. Seraphine caught it. Not fear exactly. More like recalculation. The look of someone who has just absorbed an unexpected development and is already running the contingencies. "Damien," Vivian said, turning to him, pulling his attention back to her. "She's done this. I've told you for months that she's been running her own operation against us." "The device," Damien said, flat. "Tavio showed it to me 20 minutes ago." "That doesn't mean—" "It was in the comm room, Vivian, behind the router." His jaw was set. "That's not something Seraphine planted to embarrass you. That's a surveillance operation." Vivian was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then, "I don't know anything about a device." "Paul Stern works for you," Seraphine said. "Paul Stern was a temp, hired through a staffing agency. I have nothing to do with whatever he did in—" "Which staffing agency?" Seraphine said. A pause. "I'd have to check," Vivian said. "Take your time," Seraphine said. "We're running it anyway." The 3 of them stood in the hall, and the air between them had the quality of a room where all the exits are accounted for, and everyone is quietly calculating which one they might need. Damien looked at Seraphine, then at Vivian. His expression had shifted from the morning's guilty ambivalence into something harder and less comfortable. The face of a man beginning to understand that he has been standing in the middle of a chessboard and never realized it. "I need both of you to stay in the estate today," he said. Vivian's eyes narrowed. "Damien, it's not a request," he said. "I need to make some calls. I need to understand what we're looking at. Nobody leaves until I do." He walked away down the hall. Vivian watched him go. Then she turned back to Seraphine, and the calculated, wounded expression had slipped entirely. What was underneath it was something much closer to the actual woman, sharper, colder, with the particular quality of someone who has been running this game for a very long time and doesn't panic easily. "You think you've won something," she said quietly. "I think a man is starting to ask the right questions," Seraphine said. "That won't be enough." Vivian's voice was almost conversational. "You have no idea the size of what's already in motion. One man's questions aren't going to stop it." "Probably not," Seraphine agreed. Vivian studied her. "You're not afraid." "I'm careful," Seraphine said. "There's a difference." She left Vivian standing at the base of the stairs and walked back toward the east study. She had her short list to work through. She had calls to make. She had perhaps 36 hours before whoever was directing Vivian from outside the estate recognized that their operation inside it had been partially uncovered and decided to accelerate the timeline. She sat back down at her desk. She picked up her pen. She was 7 names into the internal list, running motives, cross-referencing access, building the profile of whoever inside this house had helped wire it for sound, when her phone lit up with a message from Corinne. 4 words. Castellan called the table. She stared at the message. The black table was not something that could be summoned by outside parties. It was called by the Dons themselves, by unanimous agreement, and it ran on a schedule that had been fixed for decades. Nobody from outside the American families had the standing to accelerate it, except that the Castellan group, apparently, had found a way. Which meant someone inside the Council of Dons was working with them. Not just Damien, not just Vivian, Someone with actual standing at the table had helped move the date forward, and the gathering that Seraphine had assumed was 6 weeks away was now, according to Corinne's follow-up message, being convened in 9 days. 9 days. She set the pen down. She pressed her hands flat on the desk and breathed. 9 days to identify the insider. 9 days to build a counterposition strong enough to hold when Castellan made its move. 9 days to navigate Damien back from the edge of a mistake that could get every person in this world killed while simultaneously protecting herself from whatever Vivian still had in motion. The study was very quiet. She picked the pen back up. She turned to a fresh page. She wrote the date at the top, 9 days out, a deadline as absolute as any she'd ever faced. Then she began to write the name that had been forming at the back of her mind for the last hour. The name that fit every criterion on her internal list, that had the access and the history and the specific kind of quiet, long-burning resentment that made people vulnerable to exactly the kind of approach the Castellan group specialized in. She wrote it, looked at it, and understood that when Damien saw this name, everything he thought he knew about the last decade of his organization was going to come apart in his hands. The name on the page was Tavio. She sat with it for a long time. 30 years with the Moretti organization. 30 years of standing in doorways, running errands, delivering information, positioning himself always at the edge of rooms where decisions were made. Never at the center. Always close enough to hear everything. She ran it again, slower this time, because she didn't want to be wrong about this. Wrong about Tavio meant wasted time she didn't have. It also meant, and she acknowledged this with the unflinching honesty she demanded of herself in private, that she had trusted the wrong person with information at the worst possible moment. She had told Tavio to inform Damien about the listening device. She had told Tavio to set the meeting with Ferrante. She had told Tavio to run Paul Stern's address. If Tavio was the inside man, every one of those instructions had just been transmitted to the Castellan group within the hour. She stood up from the desk and walked to the window, pressed 2 fingers against the cold glass. The estate's east garden spread out below her. Bare trees, gravel paths, the iron gate at the far end that opened onto the side street. One of Damien's guards was standing near the gate, hands in his coat pockets, facing outward. She studied the guard for a moment. Then she went to her phone and called Declan directly, bypassing Tavio entirely for the first time in years, and kept her voice completely flat when he picked up. "The comm logs," she said. "I need to know if any outgoing transmissions left the estate in the last 2 hours from a personal device. Not the house lines. A personal phone." A pause. She could hear Declan moving somewhere, footsteps on a hard floor. "I'd need to pull the cell traffic from the property router. It logs everything that pings through the network." "How long?" 20 minutes. "Do it now," she said. "And Declan, don't mention this to Tavio." Another pause, longer this time. Declan was not a stupid man. He understood what that instruction implied without needing it explained. "Understood," he said. She hung up. She stood in the center of the study and thought about Tavio at the gala last night, the way he had watched her from across the ballroom, the deliberate nod. She had read that as loyalty, as a veteran soldier signaling that whatever happened with the necklace, his allegiance was to the thing she represented, not to the spectacle Damien had staged. What if it had been something else? What if it had been confirmation? A signal sent not to her but visible enough that she would see it and read it incorrectly. What if Tavio had known exactly what she would make of that nod, and had given it to her because it would cause her to trust him at precisely the moment his access to her plans became most valuable? She pressed her palms together. She needed to know before she moved another piece. Declan called back in 18 minutes. 3 outgoing transmissions, he said. 1 from a device registered to the household. That's probably staff. I'm running it. 1 from a number I don't have on record. Unregistered prepaid. He paused. And 1 from Tavio's phone. She didn't say anything. Seraphine, Declan's voice had dropped. Tavio's call went to a relay number, the kind that bounces. I can't get the final destination without more time, but the relay pattern, it matches the structure Iris flagged in the Castellan communications. There it was. She exhaled through her nose, one slow, controlled breath. Where's Tavio right now? She said. He was in the East Wing hallway 10 minutes ago. I saw him on the camera when I was pulling the logs. Keep eyes on him. Don't approach him. Don't let him know you've seen the logs. What do I do if he tries to leave? She thought about that for exactly 3 seconds. Stop him, she said, politely. She hung up and stood very still. 30 years. The man had been embedded for 30 years, possibly longer, or had been turned at some point in the middle of that time. She didn't know which yet, and it mattered because the timeline of what he knew and when he'd known it would determine what damage had already been done. If he'd been turned recently, the exposure was manageable. If he'd been Castellan's asset for years, the scope of the compromise was something she couldn't yet measure. She heard footsteps in the hall outside, not Tavio's pattern. Heavier, more irregular. She recognized Damien's walk even before the knock. "Come in," she said. He entered looking like a man who hadn't slept in 30 hours and had spent the last 3 of them on the phone. His jacket was off. His shirt collar was open. He was holding a glass of something amber that he hadn't been drinking from, carrying it the way people carry objects when they need something to do with their hands. He looked at her face and something in his expression shifted. "What happened?" he said. "Close the door." He did. He sat down across from her without being asked, which was what he always did when he was genuinely shaken. The performance of authority fell away, and what was left was just the man, imperfect and cornered, and not entirely sure what move to make. "Tavio," she said. He stared at her. "I need you to tell me," she said carefully, "everything you've discussed with Tavio in the past 6 months. I need you to think before you answer. I need specifics." Damien set the glass down on the edge of the desk. "What about Tavio?" "He made a call this morning that traces to a Castellan relay. Declan just confirmed it." The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man whose internal architecture is being dismantled in real time. "That's not," Damien started. "Damien! He's been with this family since before I took over. He was with my father." "I know." "That doesn't make sense. That is not—" He stood up, sat back down. "No. The call log is real. I can show you." "I don't need you to show me." He said it sharply, and she let the sharpness pass without reacting to it, because she understood it was fear dressed as anger. "I need to understand how this is possible. Tavio is not— he would not— Damien," she kept her voice level. 6 months. What did you discuss with him?" He ran a hand across his face. He looked, she thought, genuinely old in this moment. Not in years. In the particular way that certain kinds of betrayal age people, stripping the assumptions that prop up a face. "Everything," he said. The word fell into the room and stayed there. The black table agenda, the Ferrante renegotiation, the position on the Castellan approach. He stopped. "I told him about the Castellan approach." 8 months ago, the Castellan group had made a formal approach to the Moretti family, offering a partnership arrangement that would have given them a foothold in American territory. Damien had declined. The declination, the specific terms, the reasoning, the intelligence behind the decision, had been discussed in detail with his most trusted advisor, with Tavio. "They knew how to respond to every objection you raised," Seraphine said, "because they already knew what your objections would be. They came back twice," Damien said slowly. "Each time they'd addressed the previous—" He stopped again. His jaw tightened. "Each time they'd addressed exactly the points I'd raised. I thought it was good intelligence on their part. I thought they were—" "It wasn't intelligence," she said. "It was a transcript." He was quiet for a long time. "And Vivian," he said. "Vivian was the second layer. Tavio got them the operational intelligence. Vivian got them you." She paused. "Specifically, she convinced you that I had become a liability, that I was running a shadow operation, undermining your decisions, positioning myself against the organization. She needed you to remove me before the black table, and Tavio needed to be in position to manage the fallout. Because you're the one person who could have seen it coming," Damien said. She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. He picked up the glass and drank from it this time, set it back down hard enough that the sound was sharp in the quiet room. "I need to get to Tavio," he said. He was already standing. "Declan has eyes on him," she said. "Sit down." "Seraphine." "Damien." Her voice sharpened for the first time. "If you walk out there and go at Tavio right now, he will know we're on to him, and whatever he has in motion will accelerate before we can map it. Sit down." He sat down. She could see him working to control it, the fury, the humiliation, the specific rage of a man who has spent 30 years believing in something that has just been revealed as a long-running performance. It was a violent kind of grief, the kind that looked for somewhere to discharge itself immediately. She needed him to hold it for a little longer. "We have 9 days," she said. "We need every hour of them." "What do we do?" he said. His voice was different now, stripped of the defensive performance. I was asking a genuine question, and it was directed at her, and both of them understood what that meant. That regardless of the gala, regardless of the necklace, regardless of Vivian standing in their hallway with manufactured indignation, the operational reality of their situation was that Seraphine was the one who knew how to navigate this. She had known it since last night. She had waited for him to know it too. "We let Tavio believe the operation is still intact," she said. "We give him controlled information, things that are true enough to seem real but carefully shaped, so that whatever he passes to Castellan pushes them toward the position we want them in when the black table convenes. You want to run him as a double. I want to run him as a channel," she said. "He doesn't need to know he's been turned. He just needs to keep transmitting." Damien thought about it. She watched him think, watched him set aside the emotion and work the problem, which was the thing she had always respected in him, underneath everything. He was not a stupid man. He was a man who had been carefully isolated from his own better judgment, and the isolation was now lifting. "Vivian," he said, "she stays in the estate. She cannot know what we've found. She's going to push to reach her contacts." "Then give her reasons to believe the operation is on track," Seraphine said. "Give her small victories. Let her think Damien is still committed to her version of events. She'll report that upward, and it'll keep Castellan from accelerating." He looked at her. Something passed across his face that was complicated and that she didn't try to name. "You've been running a version of this plan since last night," he said. "I've been running contingencies since last night," she said. "The plan depends on variables I'm still mapping." "And what do you need from me?" "I need you to have a normal morning with Vivian. Take her to lunch. Be warm. Be conflicted about me. That part should be easy." She said it without cruelty, just accurate. He absorbed it without flinching, which told her he was further along than she'd expected. "And then," he said, "and then we go to the Ferrante meeting together, both of us. That will tell us immediately whether Augusto's people have been compromised, because if they have, there will be surveillance on that location, and we'll see it." He nodded, stood, picked up his jacket from the chair. At the door he stopped, didn't turn around fully. "The name you wrote on that paper," he said, "before Declan called. You already knew it was Tavio." She didn't answer for a moment. "I suspected," she said. "I needed confirmation before I moved." "How long had you suspected?" "Since last night," she said, "when he gave me the nod." He turned at that. His expression was something she hadn't seen on his face in a long time. Not love, they were beyond the simple version of that, but something adjacent to it. Recognition. The look of a man rediscovering something he had convinced himself wasn't there. "I'll be at lunch," he said. "Don't be late for Ferrante." He left. She sat for 30 more seconds, organizing the information, tightening the structure of the next 48 hours in her mind. Then she picked up her phone and called Corinne. "Tavio," she said when Corinne picked up. A long pause. "How deep?" "Unknown. 6 months confirmed. Could be longer." He had everything. The table agenda, the Castellan rejection parameters, the internal alliance positions. Corinne was quiet in the way she got quiet when she was running rapid calculations. If Castellan has had the alliance positions for 6 months, they may have already compromised secondary contacts inside other families. The thought had already occurred to her. "That's what I'm afraid of," she said. "The Ferrante meeting tonight will start to tell us. But I need you to run a cross-check. Any unusual financial movement inside the allied families in the past 8 months. Dormant accounts reactivating, unusual transfers, anything that might indicate a secondary inside contact. That's a broad net. I know. Pull it anyway." "Okay." Corinne paused again. "There's something else. It came in while we were talking earlier, and I sat on it because I needed to verify." Seraphine waited. "The Black Table venue," Corinne said. "It was changed this morning. New location. Off the traditional rotation." Another pause. "The new location is a Castellan-affiliated property, a resort outside Reno that they acquired through a shell 3 years ago." The room felt very still. The black table had been held at the same rotating roster of venues for 40 years. Neutral ground, historically vetted, known to every family. Moving it to a Castellan property wasn't just a logistical change, it was a declaration. It meant someone with authority to call the table had agreed to move it onto enemy ground. It meant the gathering itself, the most sacred covenant renewal in the American Mafia calendar, was being held inside a building that the Castellan group owned and controlled and could wire for whatever purpose it chose. Who agreed to the venue change, she said. That's the part that took time to verify. Corinne's voice was very careful. It required a majority sign-off from the council, 7 of 11 dons. 7, she repeated. Yes. 7 meant it wasn't one insider. It wasn't Tavio feeding intelligence to leverage 1 or 2 dons into compliance. 7 out of 11 meant Castellan had been running parallel operations inside multiple families simultaneously for long enough to build the kind of leverage that moves patriarchs. Which 7? She said. Corinne read the names. She listened. Let each one settle. 4 of them she had considered possible vulnerabilities, families with financial pressure, succession problems, territorial disputes that left them exposed to outside leverage. 3 of the names surprised her. One of the names nearly stopped her breathing. Marcus Caruso, the man who had buried 2 sons to preserve his alliance with the Moretti line, the man whose granddaughter she had asked about last night, whose hand she had watched stay perfectly still while the room applauded Vivian, whose entire body language at the gala had read, she would have sworn, as a man in solidarity with her. Marcus Caruso, she said. Signed off on the venue change at 6 this morning, Corinne said quietly. I triple-checked. She stood up. She walked to the window again. The garden below was the same as it had been an hour ago. The guard at the gate, the bare trees, the iron fence, the same world, different information about it. She had read Marcus Caruso at the gala as an ally. She had seen his stillness as resistance to Vivian's coronation, as recognition of Seraphine's true standing. She had taken his squeeze of her hand as confirmation that the eldest patriarch was with her. What if his stillness had been something else? What if he hadn't been signaling resistance to Vivienne? What if he had been watching to see whether Seraphine would break under the public humiliation, testing her response, reporting back on her state? What if the squeeze of his hand at the end of their conversation had not been solidarity, but assessment? A man checking how much fight was left in the thing he was planning to dismantle. She felt something cold move through her chest. Corinne, she said, the meeting I set with Ferrante for tonight. Yes. Who else knew about it besides me and Tavio? A terrible pause. The Ferrante people would have told their own internal contacts, Corinne said slowly. Standard practice. They confirm attendance up their own chain. If Ferrante is one of the 7, Seraphine. Corinne's voice had gone very flat. If Ferrante is one of the 7, that meeting is a setup. She looked at the guard at the gate. Then she looked more carefully. The guard's posture had changed in the last few minutes. He was no longer facing outward. He had turned inward, toward the house, and he was looking at something in his hand. A phone, possibly, or a radio. With the particular focused stillness of someone receiving instruction. She watched him for 10 seconds. He put the device away. He looked up at the house. Not scanning. Looking at a specific window. Her window. I need to call you back, she said. She ended the call. She stepped back from the glass, out of the sight line, and stood in the interior of the room with her pulse doing something she rarely allowed it to do, running fast, uncontrolled, her body responding to a threat assessment that her mind was still in the process of completing. Augusto Ferrante's name was not on Corinne's list of 7, but that list was based on the venue change sign-off. And sign-off wasn't the only way to indicate alignment with an operation. Ferrante could have been passive, could have agreed to cooperate without formally committing to the coalition. Ferrante was a cautious man, always had been. He operated through deniability and delay, never putting himself on record until the outcome was already determined. If Ferrante was watching to see which way the wind blew before committing, and if Castellan had made a compelling enough case, then the meeting she had scheduled for tonight was not what she had designed it to be. She needed to know before she walked into that room. She needed someone she could verify independently, without going through Tavio and without alerting anyone connected to the 7 families. She had 2 names left that she trusted without qualification. Corinne was one. The other was an old man who lived in a brownstone in Baltimore and did not own a cell phone and received visitors only by appointment. Benedetto Sanz, the oldest patriarch, the one who had been at her father's signing of the original covenant, the one who had looked at her at the gala last night, not at the necklace, but at her. The one whose name was not on Corinne's list. She grabbed her coat. She was at the study door when it opened from the other side, and she stopped. Tavio stood in the doorway. He was holding a small envelope. His expression was exactly what it had always been. Composed, attentive, the patient face of a man whose entire identity had been built around being the most reliable person in the room. She had read that face as loyalty for years. She read it differently now, and the difference was nauseating. "Message for you," he said, hand-delivered. The courier wouldn't give it to anyone else. She took the envelope. She did not let any of what she was feeling reach her face. "Thank you, Tavio," she said. He nodded. He left. She closed the study door and stood with her back against it and opened the envelope. One card inside. Heavyweight stock. No letterhead. 4 words in clean block print. "They know about Benedetto." She turned the card over. Blank on the back. No signature, no return. She stood very still. Someone had sent this to her knowing she was already thinking about going to Benedetto Sanz. Or someone had sent it because they knew Benedetto was a vulnerability. That he was the one remaining patriarch whose loyalty to the original covenant had never been questioned, and that the Castellan operation would need to neutralize him before the Black Table convened. She didn't know which interpretation was true. She didn't know who had sent the card. She didn't know whether the card itself was a warning or a lure designed to make her move in a direction that exposed her. She pressed the card flat against her palm. She had built every plan in the last 18 hours on the assumption that she had at least 9 days and at least a partial coalition of allied Dons to work with. Both assumptions had just been demolished simultaneously. The Black Table was moving onto enemy ground. 7 families were compromised. Her primary intelligence source inside the estate was a 30-year plant. Her planned first move, Ferrante, then Benedetto, had just been flagged as potentially known. She was not out of moves, but the one she had left required her to become something she had spent 19 years deliberately not being. She had operated from the shadows, from patience and precision and the architecture of trust her bloodline had built across decades. She had never acted openly, never put herself at the front of anything, never used the authority that the families recognized in her as anything other than a quiet foundation. What was coming required her to be visible, loud, present in a way she had never chosen to be, because the quiet approach depended on infrastructure that had just been compromised at multiple points simultaneously. She needed to call the remaining 4 Dons directly, not through intermediaries, not through Tavio, not through any channel that had touched this estate in the past 6 months. She needed to call them herself in the next 6 hours, and she needed to be persuasive enough to hold them steady when everything around them was telling them that Castellan's version of events was the winning one. And she needed to get to Benedetto Sanz before whoever had sent that card got there first. She looked at the coat still in her hand. She put it on. She walked to the desk, picked up the pen, and wrote a single sentence on a fresh page of her notepad. She left it where Declan would find it when he made his next sweep of the room. Then she walked to the window, confirmed the position of the guard at the gate, still watching the house, still waiting for something, and turned toward the interior corridor that led to the estate's secondary exit, the one that didn't cross the guard's line of sight, the one that Tavio didn't know she knew about because she had discovered it herself, quietly, 7 years ago, on a day when she had simply been mapping the bones of a house she lived in and wanted to understand completely. She moved through the corridor without turning on a light. She did not look back. Behind her, on the desk, the note to Declan read, "Trust no transmission that came through Tavio. Hold Vivian. I'll be back before dark. Do not tell Damien where I've gone." She reached the secondary exit. She pushed it open. The cold air hit her face. She stepped through and the door closed behind her with a sound as final as any she had ever heard. She moved fast through the side street, keeping close to the building line, her heels exchanging themselves in her mind for flat boots she wished she'd had the time to change into. Baltimore was 3 hours by car. She didn't have a car she trusted. Anything from the estate motor pool could be tracked, and she had no way to know how deep the compromise ran into the mechanical staff. She walked 4 blocks east, flagged a cab from a street corner the way a civilian would, and paid cash. She didn't use her phone. The cab took her to Union Station. She bought a ticket at the counter with cash, a different name spoken quietly to a clerk who wasn't paying close attention, and she sat in the last car of the 11:40 train with her coat pulled close and her eyes on the door. She thought about the card the entire ride. They know about Benedetto, 4 words. No signature. The handwriting was block print, deliberately neutralized. No loops, no slant, nothing that carried personality. The paper was the kind you could buy at any office supply store in the country. The envelope was the same. Whoever had sent it had been careful, which meant they'd had reason to be careful, which meant they were operating inside a situation where being identified carried risk, which meant they were not comfortably on either side of what was coming, not Castellan, who would have no reason to warn her, and not one of the compromised 7 who had already chosen their direction. Someone in the middle, someone watching, someone who knew enough to understand what was at stake for Benedetto and had decided, for reasons she couldn't yet read, that she should know. She filed it and kept moving. Benedetto Sassoon's brownstone sat on a quiet block in Baltimore's north side, between a dry cleaner and a retired judge's house, which Benedetto had always said was his favorite kind of location, overlooked by the respectable and ignored by the dangerous. He had lived there for 22 years since stepping back from active operations. He received visitors on Tuesday and Thursday mornings by appointment only. Today was neither. She rang the bell at 2:47 in the afternoon. A long pause. Then the sound of someone moving unhurriedly toward the door, the specific rhythm of a man in his late 80s who had decided that hurrying was for people who hadn't yet learned that most things could wait. The door opened. Benedetto Sans looked at her for 3 full seconds without speaking. Then he stepped back and held the door open and said, "I wondered how long." The interior of the brownstone smelled like coffee and old paper, and something she associated specifically with him, cedar, and the particular mustiness of rooms that held a great deal of history and didn't ventilate often. He led her to the sitting room at the back of the house, the one with the 2 worn chairs facing each other across a low table, and she sat in the one she had always sat in when she visited, which she had done perhaps a dozen times in 19 years, always with Damien, never alone. He lowered himself into the opposite chair with the careful deliberateness of someone who has made peace with the negotiation between his intentions and his body. "You came alone," he said. "Yes." "No phone." "No." He nodded slowly. "Then you already know the house is compromised." "I know the estate is," she said. "I don't know how far it extends." "Farther than you want it to." He folded his hands in his lap. His hands were still steady. She had always noticed that about him, the steadiness of a man whose nervous system had long since burned through its capacity for panic and settled into something quieter and more durable. 7 families signed the venue change. "I know." "Marcus Caruso," he said. "Yes." He looked at her face. "That surprised you." "At the gala, She stopped, recalibrated. His body language read as solidarity. "Marcus has been in financial difficulty for 14 months, Benedetto said quietly. His son's medical costs, the grandson's legal situation, things he kept very private." He paused. "The Castellan group found the private things. They always do. They offered him a resolution, and he took it because he was a man who had run out of other options. And proud men in that position make deals they would never have made when they still had room to refuse." She absorbed this. They've been building leverage files. For years. He reached over to the table and poured from a ceramic pot into a cup, which he set in front of her without asking. "On everyone, looking for the soft place. They're very patient, the Castellan people, more patient than most." "Benedetto." She leaned forward. "The card I received this morning said they know about you, that you're a target." He didn't look surprised. "I received a visitor yesterday," he said. "A man I didn't recognize, which at my age and in my position means a man who was sent rather than one who came on his own initiative." He took a slow sip from his own cup. "He made an offer. Very polite, very specific. He knew things about this house that a stranger shouldn't know. The layout, the secondary entrance, the name of the woman who cleans on Fridays." He set the cup down. "Their intelligence on me is current." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I would need time to consider." He looked at her steadily. I told him this because it was the only answer that bought me another day. She felt the weight of what he was saying. You haven't decided. I have decided, he said, and his voice was very calm. I decided the moment he left, and I sat in this chair and thought about your grandmother, and the covenant, and what it was actually built to protect. He held her gaze. But knowing what I've decided and having the means to act on it are two different problems. What do you need? I need to still be alive at the black table, he said simply. If I don't appear at the black table, my vote doesn't exist. 4 remaining families, myself, Donati, Reyes, and Sorrentino, have not signed the venue change. If all 4 of us appear and refuse to recognize the Castellan location as legitimate ground, the black table cannot be formally convened. The covenant doesn't break. He paused. But Castellan knows this arithmetic as well as we do. They'll move against you before the table. Against all 4 of us, he said, most likely in the last 48 hours before convening, when it's too late to regroup. He looked at his hands. I am 88 years old, and I live alone with a woman who comes to clean on Fridays. I am not difficult to move against. She sat with the full weight of the situation for a long moment. 4 families, 4 votes that could hold the covenant intact and deny Castellan the legitimacy it needed to restructure the American alliance on its terms. Benedetto was right about the arithmetic. The covenant's founding rules required unanimity for any formal change to its architecture. 4 refusals were enough, but 4 votes required 4 people still breathing and present when the gathering was called to order. Castellan would understand this, had understood it, which meant the operation she was looking at wasn't just Vivian and Tavio and a listening device in a comm room. It was something far larger, a coordinated elimination plan targeting 4 elderly men across 4 states, timed to execute within a 48-hour window. Where are Donati, Reyes, and Sorrentino? She said. Donati is in Philadelphia. The other 2 I don't know. We haven't spoken since the venue change notice came out this morning. He paused. If their phones are monitored, we can't reach them through normal channels, she said. No. She stood up. She walked to the window at the back of the sitting room and looked out at Benedetto's narrow garden, a strip of frozen ground and a bare fig tree that had somehow survived decades of Baltimore winters. She thought about Damien back at the estate, sitting across a lunch table from Vivian, performing warmth he didn't feel, buying her the hours she needed. She thought about the secondary exit she had used. Tavio not knowing she was gone yet, or knowing and already transmitting. She had hours at most before the operational picture shifted again. I'm going to move you, she said. I assumed. Tonight, can you travel? I can travel, he said, with the faint, dignified irritation of a man who dislikes being asked about his physical limitations. Pack for 4 days, nothing that identifies where you're going. She turned from the window. I have a location. It's not connected to the estate, not connected to any name in our world. It's clean. She paused. I'll send someone for Donati tonight as well. Reyes and Sorrentino I'll reach through Corinne, secondary channel. Nothing traceable. He looked at her for a long moment. Your grandmother, he said finally, would have done exactly this. I know, she said. She would also have been frightened, he said quietly. She just wouldn't have let it stop her. Seraphine held his gaze. She felt something move through her chest. Not comfort exactly, but something adjacent to it. The specific sensation of being fully seen by someone who knew your history and was not surprised by who you had become. I'll be back in 4 hours, she said. Be ready. She picked up her coat. She walked back through the cedar-smelling hallway, past the photographs on the wall that she had never stopped to examine carefully, but examined now. Faces from 40 years ago, men and women at tables. The particular formal posture of people who understood that what they were building was meant to outlast them. One photograph near the door showed a signing ceremony. A long table. Men on both sides. And at the center, a woman she recognized from old photographs of her own, from her mother's albums, from the single-framed portrait that had hung in her grandmother's house until everything in that house was dispersed. Her grandmother, young, 30 years old maybe, sitting at the center of the table as though she had always been there. Seraphine looked at her for 3 seconds. Then she opened the door and walked back out into the cold. She was back at the estate by 6:47. The secondary entrance was exactly as she'd left it, unlocked, unwatched, The kind of detail that only mattered if you'd thought to use it before anyone thought to cover it. She had thought to use it. That was the difference tonight between what she was and what she might have been if she'd spent the last 19 years being only a boss's wife. Declan was waiting inside the corridor. He didn't say anything. He handed her a folded page and stood back while she read it. 3 items, written in his tight, compressed hand. Tavio had made 2 more calls since morning. Vivian had sent an encrypted message from a device they hadn't previously logged. A 3rd phone, not the 2 they'd already identified, which meant there was a 3rd channel they hadn't mapped. And Damien had spent 40 minutes alone in the comm room at 4 o'clock, which shouldn't have been alarming except that the comm room's logging system had been manually disabled for exactly those 40 minutes and then re-enabled. She looked up from the page. "The comm room," she said quietly. "The disable sequence requires a 6-digit code," Declan said. "Only 4 people have that code." "Who?" "You, the boss, the head of technical staff. And Tavio." She folded the page. "Was Tavio in the comm room at 4? "No, he was in the East Hall. I had eyes on him the entire time." So Damien went into the comm room, disabled logging, made a communication we can't see, and re-enabled it. Yes. She stood very still in the dim corridor. She had given Damien a role in this. She had read his response to the Tavio revelation as genuine, the shock, the fury, the stripped-down asking of what do we do. She had built the next phase around his cooperation. She ran the alternative now, fast and cold. Damien had been with Vivian for 2 years. Vivian had been planted by Castellan 4 years ago. If the operation was sophisticated enough to embed Tavio for months and compromise 7 families simultaneously, it was sophisticated enough to have a contingency for the moment the primary asset, Damien himself, began to waver. The contingency would be a second hook, something deeper than Vivian, something that didn't depend on emotion or attraction or manufactured intel reports. She thought about the Castellan Group's original approach 8 months ago, the partnership offer that Damien had rejected. She thought about how Vivian had entered his life 6 months before that approach was made. She thought about Tavio feeding Castellan the terms of Damien's rejection so they could come back with perfectly calibrated counter-arguments. None of that required Damien's knowing cooperation, but the comm room at 4 o'clock did. She breathed through it. "Where is he now?" she said. "Dining room. Vivian is with him." "Keep watching the comm room. If anyone goes near it in the next 3 hours, I want to know immediately." She paused. "And Declan, the 4 families I mentioned, 2 additional safe location requests will come through Corinne's channel tonight. Accommodate them without logging." He nodded once and disappeared back into the interior. She went to the dining room. Damien and Vivian were at opposite ends of the long table, the remains of dinner between them, a bottle of red wine 2/3 gone. The scene had the surface appearance of a couple in the early stages of a relationship still performing ease, still trying to look natural in a room too large and too formal for what they actually were. Vivian looked up first. Her eyes moved across Seraphine with the quick, comprehensive read of a woman who had spent years assessing threats and was very good at it. Whatever she calculated took less than 2 seconds and left her expression perfectly composed. "Seraphine," she said. Warm, almost convincing. Damien's eyes came up slower. He looked at her coat, which she hadn't taken off. He looked at her face. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. He looked away first. She knew then. She didn't know what exactly he had done in that comm room, but she knew it was not something he could tell her about in this room with Vivian present, and the not telling, to the specific quality of how he couldn't hold her eyes, told her it wasn't nothing. She pulled out the chair nearest to her and sat. "The Ferrante meeting was moved," she said. "Tomorrow morning instead of tonight. Change of schedule on their end." This was a lie. She had canceled the Ferrante meeting entirely through Corinne 2 hours ago, rerouted it to a clean channel, and was not going to that restaurant under any circumstances. But Tavio needed to hear that the meeting was still happening, on a different schedule, so that whatever surveillance had been arranged around the original timing would be caught flat-footed. Damien's jaw moved slightly. "That's fine. I thought I'd let you know." "Thank you," he said. The word sat wrong in his mouth. She'd heard Damien say thank you in 1,000 registers over 19 years, and this one was performing normalcy over something that was working very hard not to show. Vivian poured herself more wine. How was your afternoon? She asked Seraphine. Productive, Seraphine said. She stayed for 12 more minutes, long enough to be unremarkable, short enough to not create an opportunity for anyone to say something that required a response she didn't want to give yet. Then she excused herself, went to her room, and sat on the edge of the bed with her hands in her lap. She gave herself 5 minutes to feel the full shape of where she was. Tavio was compromised. Vivian was operational. 7 families had signed. Benedetto was being moved tonight. Donati had been reached. Corinne had confirmed that while she was on the train back. Reyes and Sorrentino were being contacted through a physical messenger, old method, the kind that couldn't be intercepted digitally. And Damien. She didn't know where Damien was yet. She made a decision. She stood, changed out of her coat, and into clothes that allowed her to move, dark, layered, flat shoes. And at 9:43, she walked to the comm room and entered it alone. She sat at the primary terminal and pulled the manual log file. The disable sequence left a ghost record even when the main log was turned off, a 3-digit timestamp marker that Tavio had never known about because she had found it buried in the system documentation 7 years ago and had told no one, filed it away the way she filed everything that might someday be the difference between knowing and not knowing. She pulled the timestamp, cross-referenced it against the outgoing line activity. One call had been made from the comm room at 4:08 p.m. Duration 11 minutes. The number it connected to was routed through a relay. The same relay structure as Tavio's calls. The same Castellan architecture. She sat with that for a moment. Then she pulled the audio recovery function, another piece of the system documentation that was not in the standard operator manual, that she had found because she had read every page of every manual for every system in this estate in year 3 of her marriage, because she had understood even then that the knowledge lived in the details nobody else bothered with. The recovery was partial. The disable sequence had interrupted the automatic recording, but the last 40 seconds of the call had captured before the system re-enabled. She put on the headset. She heard Damien's voice first, mid-sentence. Can't hold her off much longer. She's already asking the right... A voice she didn't recognize, flat, accented faintly with something Eastern European. The timeline moves regardless. You understood this. Damien, I understood a different timeline. 9 days was... The voice. The table convenes in 72 hours. Not 9 days. 72 hours. Silence on Damien's end. She could hear his breathing through the recording. The voice. Your position is guaranteed regardless of outcome. We've told you this. Damien. And if she figures out... The voice. Then you manage her. That was always your role in this. The recording ended. She pulled the headset off. She sat in the comm room in the dark with the particular quality of quiet that comes after something irreversible has been confirmed. 72 hours. Not 9 days. The black table was being convened in 3 days, not 6 weeks, and Damien had known. He had known when she laid out her 9-day plan this morning, and he had nodded along and asked her what she needed from him and performed the stripped-down sincerity of a man rediscovering his better instincts. She thought about his eyes at dinner, the way he hadn't been able to hold her gaze. He hadn't been unable to hold it out of guilt about a simple comm call. He'd been unable to hold it because he was managing her, because that was his assigned role in this, and he was, even now, executing it. She left the comm room. She walked to the east study and closed the door and called Corinne. 72 hours, she said when Corinne answered, a sharp intake of breath. That's not possible. The notice period for the black table requires... They're not following the notice period. They have 7 families. They have the venue. They have Damien. She paused on that last part, let Corinne hear what it meant. Corinne was quiet for 4 seconds. How deep? He was on a call with them at 4 o'clock. He knew the timeline had moved. He didn't tell me. Seraphine. Corinne's voice had the particular quality it got when she was frightened and refusing to be governed by it. If Damien is actively cooperating, I know. Your position in that estate is, I know. She moved past it. The 4 families. Benedetto, Donati, Reyes, Sorrentino. I need them in one location by tomorrow night, somewhere that isn't connected to any name in this conversation. Can you do that? I have a property in Western Virginia. It's registered to a trust that hasn't been touched in 12 years. No connection to any current operation. Use it. Get all 4 there by 10 tomorrow night. And you? I'll be there. She paused. I need one more thing. The unsigned families, myself and the 4 holdouts, were 5. Castellan needs 9 of 11 for a governing majority that can formally restructure the covenant. 7 isn't enough. They need 2 more, which means they need to either flip 2 of the remaining 4 or eliminate them before the table convenes. Yes. She thought about the sender of the card. They know about Benedito, someone who knew Castellan's targeting list, someone who was not fully committed to the Castellan side. There's a potential loose piece somewhere in their coalition. Someone sent me a warning this morning. I need to find who. How? The card came through the estate's front door, hand-delivered. Someone brought it to the gate. She thought. Pull the exterior camera logs from this morning. There was a courier at the gate. I need to identify them. I can get into the estate system remotely. Declan gave me the access 6 months ago. Do it tonight. She ended the call. She was crossing the hallway toward the back stairs when the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a gradual dimming. All at once, the entire estate went black, and in the half-second before her eyes adjusted, she heard 3 things in rapid succession. A door opening somewhere on the ground floor, the sound of something heavy falling in the direction of the kitchen, and running footsteps on the gravel outside the east windows. She pressed herself against the wall. Her heart was doing what she'd told Damien she could control and was only partially controlling. Fast, too fast, pushing blood into her extremities with the specific urgency of a body that has recognized danger before the mind has fully processed it. She counted to 3 in the dark. Then she moved. Not toward the sound. Away from it. Toward the back of the house, toward the internal staircase that led to the secondary exit, because her first priority was not engaging whatever this was, but understanding the shape of it before she was caught inside it. She made it to the staircase. At the bottom, she nearly ran into Declan. I was in the dark too, moving fast, a flashlight in one hand and his other hand occupied with something she didn't examine closely. He grabbed her arm to stop the collision, and they both went still. How many? She said, barely above a whisper. 3 that I've confirmed. Possibly more outside. His voice was completely flat. Operational. They hit the power junction on the north side. Professional job. Clean cut. Not a fuse. Where's Tavio? East hallway. He was walking toward the comm room when the lights dropped. Of course he was. Damien. Still in the dining room last I had visual. Vivian with him. She thought fast. 3 confirmed. Professional power cut. The estate had 40 rooms on 3 floors and 9 possible entry points she had personally mapped. 3 operatives could cover 3 entry points simultaneously, which left 6 unmanned, which was either a resource limitation or an indication that they knew exactly which 3 points mattered, which meant they had the floor plan, which meant Tavio had given it to them. Get to Damien, she said. Don't let Vivian out of your sight. Bring them both to the center hall. It's the most defensible interior space. She paused. And Declan, if Damien resists, if he says he needs to go somewhere, if he tries to separate from you for any reason. I understand, Declan said. He moved. She went the other direction. She knew where the breaker junction for the east wing was. She knew it because she had walked this house's systems the same way she had walked its floor plan and its personnel files and its comm system documentation, because knowing things before you needed them was the only form of preparation that actually worked. The junction box was in a utility space off the laundry corridor. She felt her way there in the dark, hand on the wall, counting doorways. She got to the utility space and pulled the box open by touch and found the emergency bypass switch, an analog backup that ran on a separate circuit, installed 15 years ago by an electrician who had since retired, noted in the building maintenance file she had read in year 4 of her marriage. She flipped it. A third of the estate's lights came back. Not all. Not the exterior perimeter, but enough. The hallways, the interior rooms, the stairwells. Enough to see. She heard someone curse. Male voice. Not from anywhere in her immediate vicinity. 1 floor up, toward the front of the house. Someone who had been moving in darkness and had just lost that advantage. She moved toward the sound. She came up the back staircase to the 2nd floor and stopped at the top. A man she had never seen was standing in the hallway outside the study she had used all day. He was dressed in dark operational clothing. He had the particular stillness of someone trained to stop and reassess when conditions change. He was reassessing now, looking down the hallway, calculating. He hadn't seen her yet. She had exactly two options: back down the stairs, which would make noise, or stay still and wait for him to choose a direction. She stayed still. He chose the wrong direction, away from her toward the front of the house. He had a destination. He was moving with purpose, not searching. He knew where he was going. He was going to the study. The notepad. Her notes. 3 pages of names, cross-references, the architecture of everything she had mapped over the last 24 hours. She moved. She was faster than him because she knew the hallway's length by foot, and he was navigating by new knowledge. And she came around the long way through the connecting corridor and reached the study door first, pulled it open, grabbed the notepad from the desk, and was back out and moving before he reached the doorframe. She heard him come into the empty study as she turned the corner. A beat of silence. Then his voice, clipped, accented, into a radio. "Study is clear. She's been warned." Another voice through the radio, too small to fully hear. First voice. "Confirmed. Adjust." She didn't stop to understand what they were adjusting. She moved down the connecting corridor toward the center hall, where she could hear voices, Declan and Damien, and at least one more person who was saying something she couldn't make out from this distance. She came into the center hall and stopped. Damien was there. Declan was there, positioned in a way that put himself between Damien and the hall entrance. Vivian was there, and Tavio was there, holding a gun in a way that suggested he had held guns before and had no particular conflict about the act. It was pointed at Seraphine. She had walked directly into the mouth of it. "Close the door," Tavio said. His voice was exactly what it had always been, measured, patient, without effect. 30 years of that voice, reading it as reliability, as the most fundamental kind of steadiness. She looked at it now and saw the performance underneath the performance. And what was under both of those things was simply a man who had been doing a job for a very long time. She didn't close the door. "The men you sent to the study found an empty room," she said. "I know," Tavio said. "You took the notes." "I took the notes." He looked at her. He didn't seem angry. He seemed like a man completing a calculation. "You went to Sans." "I went to Baltimore," she said, not confirming Benedetto, not giving him the specific. "It doesn't matter at this point," he said. "The table is in 68 hours. Whatever Sans intends to do, whatever the other 3 intend to do, the outcome is already determined." He tilted his head slightly. "The Castellan group controls the venue and the majority. The 4 holdout families will be given an opportunity to join the new structure or—" He paused. "Or they won't be at the table," she said. "Yes." "You've been doing this for how long?" she said, not accusing, genuinely asking. 11 years, he said. She felt that land. 11 years. Not 6 months of Vivian, not 8 months of the Castellan approach. 11 years. Which meant he had been Castellan's asset since Damien was still in the first years of his leadership, since the organization was at its most vulnerable and its most open, since the trust between Damien and his longest-serving advisor was at its most foundational. 11 years of listening. 11 years of knowing everything. She looked at Damien. He was standing to Tavio's left, and his face had the look of a man in a room with no walls he recognizes anymore. Everything familiar stripped of the meaning he'd assigned to it. "Did you know?" she said to Damien. Flat, direct. He shook his head. She looked at his eyes. She looked carefully. She believed him. He hadn't known about Tavio. He had known about the comm call. He had known about the timeline. He had cooperated with Castellan through Vivian, and he had spent this afternoon managing Seraphine the way they'd told him to. But Tavio, the 11 years, that was on Damien's face as something new and devastating, and you couldn't fake the specific way a man looks when the floor he thought was stone turns out to have been paper the whole time. "Damien," Tavio said, and his voice was almost gentle. "She can't change the outcome. The vote structure is settled." "The vote structure requires 9 of 11, Seraphine said. "You have 7. "We have 8, Tavio said. "The Donati family confirmed 2 hours ago." Corinne had reached Donati through physical messenger. The messenger had been intercepted or the channel had been compromised, which meant Castellan had gotten to Donati before her, or Donati had been theirs all along, and her contact had simply confirmed for them that she was reaching out. 8 families. 1 more would be enough, which left Benedetto, Reyes, and Sorrentino standing between Castellan and the vote they needed and at least one of those three was now the most important target in the country. From the east end of the hall, a sound, a door, and footsteps. More than one person. Two of the operational team came into the center hall from the east corridor, and they were not alone. Between them, handled with the specific carefulness of something valuable rather than the roughness of something to be eliminated, was a man in a rumpled suit who looked as though he had been pulled from somewhere fast. She recognized him. Reyes. Rafael Reyes, the patriarch of the Reyes family out of Texas, who was supposed to be unreachable through normal channels and was supposed to be in transit to Western Virginia by tonight. He was in her house. He looked at her. His expression was not afraid. It was the expression of a man who has been through difficult rooms before and is taking inventory of this one. "They were waiting at my hotel," he said to her. Calm, almost conversational. 2 hours ago. Tavio glanced at him, then back to Seraphine. 8 families confirmed. Reyes makes the math difficult for the opposition. He paused. "We need one more. Benedetto Sans has already been approached." He looked at her with what appeared to be genuine respect. "We expected you to have reached him by now. We expected him to be in transit. That part of your plan was sound." "Where is he?" she said. Tavio didn't answer. Declan moved. It was fast, and it shouldn't have worked, but it did. He covered the distance to Tavio in 2 steps, driving his shoulder low, the kind of movement you only learn by doing it many times in rooms where the alternative was worse. The gun discharged into the ceiling. Plaster came down. The 2 operatives by Reyes moved toward Declan. Damien moved first. She had not anticipated that. After the calm room, after the managed afternoon, after everything she had spent the last hour recalibrating, she had not anticipated that Damien Moretti would throw himself between his oldest capo's armed backup team and the man currently trying to protect his wife. He took the impact of the first operative's shove and didn't go down, which surprised the operative too, and in that half-second of mutual surprise, Reyes moved, elbowing the second man hard in the throat, a short, vicious movement that dropped him to one knee. The center hall erupted. Seraphine didn't freeze. She crossed the room in 5 steps, reached Tavio where Declan had him pinned against the wall, and took the gun from the floor where it had landed. She straightened. She held it in both hands. The room stopped. Everyone looked at her. She was breathing hard. Her hands were not shaking, which surprised her slightly, because she had never held a gun in this room before, had never stood in the center of her own house with the specific weight of this kind of moment pressing on everything. Tavio looked at her from the floor, not afraid, calculating. "Benedetto," she said. "Where?" "It doesn't matter," he said. "The vote—" "Benedetto," she said again. Harder. "He won't change anything," Tavio said. "You're 1 vote short, and you have no way to get to the remaining families in 68 hours without going through us." "I'll ask one more time," she said. Something shifted in his face. Not submission. Something more like the resigned recognition of a man who has just identified the exact point at which the plan he'd been running for 11 years has encountered something it did not account for. He hadn't accounted for her standing in this hall with a gun and 68 hours left and the specific quality of someone who has nothing left to perform. "He's in Baltimore," Tavio said. "Still at the brownstone. Our team moved on the property at 6 o'clock. He paused. He was already gone. She felt something release in her chest. Benedetto had gotten out. "Then we're going to the table," she said. She looked at Damien, who was standing 3 feet away with blood on his lower lip from where someone's elbow had caught him, looking at her with an expression she had seen on his face only a handful of times in 19 years. The particular look of a man who has just watched someone be exactly what he had spent years not appreciating. "Can you drive?" she said to him. He touched his lip. "Yeah," he said. "Then we're leaving now." She looked at Declan, who had Tavio contained and was holding him with the focused patience of someone who will hold that position for as long as necessary. "Don't let him make a call." "I won't," Declan said. She looked at Reyes, who was straightening his jacket with the unhurried dignity of a man who refuses to let circumstances make him look disheveled. "Mr. Reyes?" she said. "You're with us." "Wouldn't miss it," he said. She turned toward the door. Behind her, Tavio's voice, still measured, still the voice she had read as reliability for 30 years. "You can't get to the other 2 in time, even if Sans is free. You're still 1 vote short.
You'll walk into that table and Castellan will have the majority, and we'll see, she said, and walked out. The night air hit her face. Damien was 2 steps behind her. Reyes was on her right. She had a gun she'd never fired in 67 hours and 50 minutes, and 1 vote somewhere in the country that she had not yet reached, and a building that Castellan owned waiting at the end of a road in Nevada where the most consequential gathering of her world was about to convene with or without her consent. She got into the car. She looked straight ahead through the windshield at the dark road. "Drive," she said. Damien drove like a man who had made a decision and wasn't revisiting it. No conversation in the first 40 minutes, just the road and the dark and the sound of the engine, and Reyes in the back seat doing what experienced men do in uncertain situations, conserving himself, eyes half closed, not sleeping but resting the machinery. Seraphine sat in the passenger seat with the gun in the door pocket and her phone in her hand, and Corinne on a text thread that was moving fast. Benedetto had reached the Virginia property at 9:14. Corinne had confirmed it in 3 words. "He's here, safe." Sorrentino had confirmed 30 minutes later. He'd been harder to reach, an 80-year-old man in rural Connecticut who had resisted cell phones on principle for a decade. But his granddaughter had driven him to a gas station payphone, and Corinne's contact had been waiting on the other end of the line. That left the count at Seraphine, Benedetto, Reyes in the back seat, and Sorrentino, 4 votes. Still 1 short of the 5 needed to create the deadlock that would prevent Castellan from achieving the 9 of 11 governing majority. She needed Sorrentino to hold. She needed to find the 10th vote somewhere in a coalition that Castellan had spent 11 years building. And she needed to do both of those things before they walked into a building in Nevada that the enemy owned. She typed to Corinne, the loose piece, the card sender. "Did you find them on the camera log?" 3 minutes passed. Then, yes. Courier was a woman, early 60s, drove a green Honda, plates registered to a holding company in Delaware, still running the thread. "How long?" "Give me 2 hours." She put the phone down and watched the road. "You're working something," Damien said. "I'm always working something." He was quiet for a moment. "The comm call," he said. "This afternoon." "I know about it." "I know you know." His hands adjusted on the wheel. "I want to explain it." "You don't have to." "I want to." He exhaled. "They came to me 3 months ago, not through Vivian, directly. A man named Harlan. I never got a last name. He said they had documentation that would expose the financial structure of the entire Moretti operation to federal prosecution. Real documentation. The kind that—" He stopped, started again. "The kind that had clearly come from inside, from someone who had access to every layer of the books." "Tavio," she said. "I didn't know that then. I just knew the documentation was real, and they had it, and they said the price of it going away was my cooperation with the transition. What did they want from you specifically?" "To not interfere. To let the Castellan restructuring happen. To bring Vivian into position so the optics read as a voluntary leadership evolution instead of a hostile takeover." His voice was flat. "Reporting." He wasn't defending it. "They told me you were already aware of the situation and had made your own arrangement." She turned to look at him. "They told you I had already made a deal with Castellan," she said. "Yes. And you believed it." It's a long pause. "I wanted to believe you were safe," he said. "That's not the same thing as believing it." She turned back to the road. She sat with that for a while. The specific wreckage of what it meant that both of them had spent months operating on false intelligence about the other, circling each other in a house full of someone else's lies, both convinced the other had already chosen a side. 11 years of Tavio. And they had never once compared notes, because the marriage had deteriorated to the point where comparison of notes required a conversation they'd both been avoiding. She thought about what Corinne had said weeks ago in a different context. The people who can't be manipulated at all are the ones with nothing they care about. Damien had cared, about the wrong things and in the wrong directions, and with terrible judgment about who deserved his trust. But he had cared. That was the thing underneath all of it that she kept returning to, the thing she didn't know what to do with yet. "When we get into that building," she said, "I need you to follow my lead, not because I don't trust your judgment in a room. Because the room won't trust mine," he said, "not after the gala." "Yes." He nodded once. She looked back at her phone. Corinne's message came at 1:47 a.m. while they were crossing into Virginia to pick up the others. Delaware Holding Company traces to a law firm in Philadelphia. The law firm has one partner who appears in the Castellan financial architecture, a name you'll recognize. But the Honda is registered to a trust that goes a different direction entirely. Family name, Caruso. She stared at the name. Marcus Caruso's daughter-in-law, Corinne continued. She's the one who drove the courier. She didn't know what was in the envelope. At least that's my read based on the camera footage. She stopped 2 blocks from your estate, handed the envelope to a bicycle courier, and drove away. The bicycle courier brought it to your gate. She thought about Marcus Caruso. 88 years old, 2 sons buried, a granddaughter in medical school in Philadelphia, a man who had signed the venue change at 6 in the morning because he was out of options, and Castellan had given him away to protect what was left of his family. But his daughter-in-law had delivered a warning to Seraphine. Not Marcus. His family. She thought about what Benedetto had said. He was a man who had run out of other options, and proud men in that position make deals they would never have made when they still had room to refuse. Marcus had made the deal, but someone in his family, someone who knew what was in motion and what it would cost, had sent a card to the woman most likely to be able to stop it. She typed to Corinne, "Can you reach the daughter-in-law directly, tonight?" A pause. Then, "I can try." Try. She put the phone down. Damien glanced at her. "Something." "Possibly," she said. "Drive faster." He reached the Virginia property at 3 in the morning. It was a farmhouse set back from a state road on 12 acres of nothing in particular, the kind of property that looks like it was bought without ambition and maintained without inspiration, which was exactly why it had survived 12 years without being connected to anything that mattered. Corinne met them at the door. Inside, in the farmhouse's main room, Benedetto Sans was sitting in the best chair with his hands folded and his eyes sharp, looking like a man who had been inconvenienced but not rattled. Sorrentino sat across from him, younger by 10 years and substantially broader, a man whose physical presence had always been his primary instrument of authority, and who even now, in a farmhouse at 3 a.m., managed to occupy space like he owned it. Reyes came in behind Seraphine and Sorrentino stood automatically. The 3 of them looked at each other with the recognition of men who have known each other for decades across a complicated landscape of alliance and competition. "You look terrible," Sorrentino said to Reyes. "You look worse," Reyes said, and sat down. Benedetto looked at Seraphine. "You found the 9th vote," he said. Not a question. "I think so," she said. "I need 2 more hours." "We have 63, Benedetto said. "Take 3 if you need them." She sat at the farmhouse kitchen table and worked the phone while the others moved through the practical rhythms of men settling in for a long night. Coffee, quiet conversation, the particular companionship of people who have found themselves in difficult rooms before and know how to be in them without performing distress. Damien sat at the far end of the table. He didn't join the conversation with the other 3 men. He made his own coffee and he sat with it, and he watched Seraphine work. And she was aware of him watching in the peripheral way she was aware of most things. Noted, filed, not addressed yet. Corinne's call came at 5:08 a.m. "Elena Caruso," Corinne said. "Marcus Caruso's daughter-in-law. She was at the gala with him." Seraphine remembered. The quietly formidable woman. The one she had been talking to when the music stopped. "She sent the card," Corinne said. "She confirmed it. She has a message from Marcus." "Tell me." "He signed the venue change because they had documentation that would have destroyed his grandson. Not financial, criminal. The boy was involved in something 3 years ago that Marcus buried, and Castellan found the burial." Corinne paused. "Elena says Marcus has been sick about it since he signed. He doesn't want this. He wants a way out that doesn't cost the boy." "Is there a way out that doesn't cost the boy?" "That's what she's asking you." Seraphine thought about it. The documentation was real. She had no ability to make it disappear, and promising to do so would be a lie, and she didn't deal in those. But documentation that Castellan held as leverage over Marcus Caruso was documentation that had likely been provided by Tavio, and documentation provided through an 11-year operation of illegal intelligence gathering had its own legal vulnerabilities. She thought about the attorney in Philadelphia who appeared in the Castellan financial architecture.
The documentation Castellan has on the Caruso grandson, she said. Does Elena know how they obtained it? She said they claimed to have it through a confidential source inside the Philadelphia DA's office. A source who was paid, Seraphine said, with Castellan money, through traceable channels, if you know where to look. She paused. Corinne, the financial threads you've been running on Castellan, is the Philadelphia connection clean enough to trace to a specific payment? A long silence. Corinne was working. It's going to take, how long? 4 hours. You have 3. She hung up and went to find Benedetto. He was on the farmhouse's small back porch, standing in the pre-dawn cold with his coat buttoned to the collar, looking at the dark field behind the property with the quiet attention of a man who has found a way to be fully present in the time he has left. She stood beside him. Marcus Caruso, she said. I know, he said. You knew he signed. I suspected. The granddaughter called me 2 weeks ago. She was worried about her grandfather. I could hear it in what she wasn't saying. He turned his head slightly toward her. The boy Marcus is protecting. He's a good boy who made one serious mistake. Marcus has been carrying it alone for 3 years. If I can give him a way out, he'll come back, Benedetto said simply. Marcus Caruso is not a Castellan man. He is a frightened grandfather. Those are very different things. She looked at the field. 9 votes, she said. If Marcus comes back, we have 9. That's the deadlock. They can't restructure the covenant. No, Benedetto said. But they'll still try to convene the table on their terms. 7 families against 4, plus Marcus if he comes back. And Castellan controlling the room. He paused. The vote protects the covenant structure. It doesn't protect the people in that building. She understood what he was saying. Castellan needed the legitimacy of a proper vote to achieve what they wanted. If they couldn't get the vote, they would have other methods. The building in Nevada was theirs. The security would be theirs. And 9 votes meant nothing if the 4 holdout families walked into that building and didn't walk back out. We need something that stops them from using force as a substitute for legitimacy, she said. Yes, she thought. The federal documentation, she said slowly. Tavio provided Castellan with financial records on the Moretti operation. Real records. Enough for prosecution. She turned to look at him. If those records were already in federal hands, if the documentation Castellan was holding as leverage had already been voluntarily disclosed to the appropriate authorities as part of a cooperation arrangement, it stops being leverage. Benedetto was very still. You're talking about exposing the Moretti books, he said. I'm talking about removing the weapon from their hands before they can use it. That would destroy the Moretti organization. The Moretti organization is already compromised, she said. 11 years of Tavio. Anything that ran through that organization in 11 years is potentially known to Castellan and potentially usable against every family connected to us. She paused. A voluntary disclosure, a narrow, carefully constructed arrangement, removes the leverage and exposes Castellan's intelligence operation at the same time. They can't use material they obtained through a corrupt DA's office source. The moment that comes to light, everything they're holding becomes a liability instead of a weapon. Benedetto was quiet for a long time. The sky was beginning to separate from the dark. That first barely perceptible lightning at the horizon that isn't yet dawn but is the promise of it. Damien would have to agree, he said. I know. It would end his career. I know. And yours, potentially. My career was never what I was protecting, she said. He looked at her with those 88-year-old eyes that had seen every version of every kind of person this world produced. No, he said quietly. I don't suppose it was. She went to find Damien. He was still at the kitchen table. The coffee cup was empty, and he'd been sitting with it for a while, judging by the way his shoulders had settled. He looked up when she came in. She sat across from him. She told him what she was thinking, all of it, clearly, without softening the edges. He listened without interrupting, which was not a thing he had historically been good at, and which told her more about where he was than any words he might have chosen. When she finished, he was quiet for close to a minute. The organization, he said. Much of it would have to be restructured or dissolved, she said. The parts Tavio touched, which is most of it. 11 years, he said. Yes. He looked at the table. She watched him sit with it, the full weight of it, which was the weight of what he had built, and what had been built underneath it without his knowledge, and the specific impossibility of separating those two things cleanly.
The Castellan documentation on the Moretti books, he said. If it goes to federal authorities as a voluntary disclosure, what does that look like for the people who were part of the organization? It depends on the arrangement, she said. I can't promise outcomes, but a voluntary disclosure with cooperation. Reduced exposure, he said. For most, not all. He absorbed that. And Castellan loses the leverage, he said, and their intelligence operation gets exposed, and the black table deadlocks because Marcus comes back. That's the plan. And then we walk into a building in Nevada that they own, he said, and we stand in a room where 7 of the families have committed to their side, and we make the case for the covenant. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. You've already decided this is what we're doing, he said. I've decided it's the right move, she said. I'm asking you. He looked down at the empty cup. You're asking me, he repeated. It's your organization, Damien, regardless of everything. He was quiet for another long moment. She didn't feel it. She let him have the weight of the thing because he had earned the right to feel it fully before he answered. Do it, he said. Corinne delivered the Castellan financial threads at 6:42 a.m. The Philadelphia connection was clean enough. 3 payments to a contact inside the DA's office, traceable through the Luxembourg holding company, documented with dates and amounts. Enough to expose the method by which Castellan had obtained its leverage material. The voluntary disclosure was structured and transmitted through a federal contact that Seraphine had cultivated for 9 years and never used. She used it now. The conversation was 12 minutes long and left both parties with clear understanding of what was being offered and what was being asked in return. By 9 a.m., the structure was in place. At 10:15, Corinne confirmed that Marcus Caruso had been reached through Elena and had, in his daughter-in-law's words, wept with relief and then become the most determined 88-year-old man Elena had ever encountered. 9 votes. They drove to Nevada in 2 cars. The Cascade Resort was exactly what the name suggested. A large property in the hills outside Reno that had been built for a luxury market and had declined gracefully into something more discreet, more functional, still beautiful, in the way that expensive things maintain even when their original purpose has shifted. It sat behind iron gates on 40 acres. The parking area as they arrived held vehicles from every family, black cars, dark windows, the anonymous wealth of people who had learned not to advertise. Seraphine got out and stood for a moment. She could feel the building, the controlled temperature of a space that somebody owned and somebody else was walking into, and the understanding that those 2 facts mattered and could not be pretended away. Reyes stood beside her, Sorrentino. Benedetto, who had been helped from the car by Corinne's contact, and who now stood with his cane and his steady hands and his 88 years of refusal to be anything other than what he was. Damien stood slightly behind her. She walked in. The main hall of the Cascade Resort had been arranged for the black table. A long central table, chairs for each family's delegation, the formal structure of a gathering that had run on the same bones for 4 decades, now transplanted into a room that belonged to the people waiting to dismantle it. Castellan's representatives were not at the table. They were in the room, 4 men she hadn't seen before, positioned along the wall with the quiet readiness of people who know they don't need to announce themselves to be felt. The 7 allied families were seated. The room went very still when Seraphine walked to her chair. She had expected hostility. What she got was something more complicated. A room full of people who had made commitments they were not entirely comfortable with, sitting in a building that was starting to feel less like opportunity and more like the thing it actually was. Looking at the woman who had walked in carrying whatever she was carrying and finding themselves uncertain in ways they hadn't expected to be. The representative of the Castellan group was a man named Aldrich Voss, 50 years old, silver-haired, the kind of compose that is built rather than natural. He came to the table when everyone was seated and stood at the head and looked at the assembled families with the expression of a man who believes the difficult part is already over. We appreciate the attendance of all families, he said. The agenda for today's table is straightforward. Before we begin, Seraphine said. He looked at her. The room looked at her. She did not raise her voice. She had never needed to. The documentation that the Castellan group has been using to compel cooperation from member families was transmitted to federal authorities this morning as part of a voluntary disclosure arrangement, she said. The specific documentation includes records obtained through a paid source inside the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, a federal crime. The payment records have been provided to investigators. She paused. Every commitment made to the Castellan group on the basis of that leverage is therefore void. The families affected have been so advised. The room was completely silent. Aldrich Voss's composed expression held for approximately 3 seconds. Then something moved underneath it. Not panic. The man was trained past panic, but the specific recognition of a prepared position becoming untenable in real time. That's an extraordinary claim, he said. The documentation supporting it is already in federal hands, she said, which means the claim's credibility is no longer dependent on anything I say in this room. She looked at the 7 seated families. She didn't speak to them with authority. She didn't invoke her bloodline or her grandmother or the Covenant's history. She simply looked at them the way she had always looked at people in rooms like this, clearly, without performance, with the specific quality of someone who has no reason to be anything other than what she actually is. Marcus Caruso was not in the room. He was too old to have made the Nevada drive in time. But his delegate, his son Luca, who had the Caruso jaw and his father's measured eyes, raised his hand deliberately from his chair and said, "The Caruso family withdraws its endorsement of the venue change." 1. Silence. Then, from across the table, a delegate Seraphine had not expected, the Marchetti family out of Boston, who had been on Corinne's list of 7, who had signed the venue change and who she had not had time to reach, stood up slowly. "The Marchetti family has concerns about the legitimacy of this proceeding," he said. "We're not prepared to vote until those concerns are addressed." Not a withdrawal, but a hesitation. A crack. Aldrich Voss was speaking, rapidly, controlled, making arguments that were technically coherent and operationally irrelevant because the room had changed and he could hear it changing, and the arguments were the sound of a man trying to hold water in open hands. 2 more families shifted in their chairs. Seraphine didn't move. She had learned this from her grandmother's photograph, from the woman sitting at the center of the table like she had always been there. You don't have to push. You don't have to perform. You hold your position and you let the room find its own level, because rooms, like water, will always find their level if you give them time and remove the thing that was artificially holding them in the wrong shape. Aldrich Voss stopped speaking. He looked at her. She looked back at him. "The black table cannot be formally convened on this property," she said. "The founding covenant specifies neutral ground, verified by unanimous consent. That standard has not been met." She looked around the table. "I propose we adjourn to the Veltrano estate, the traditional venue, and reconvene in 48 hours. Any family with concerns about the legitimacy of the proceedings can raise them then, in a proper setting, under proper conditions." The silence stretched. Then Benedetto Sanz, who had said nothing since entering the room, and whose presence had been doing the work that presence does in rooms like this, the weight of 88 years and an unbroken record of integrity, placed both hands on the table and stood. He was slow about it. He used the cane. Nobody helped him, and he didn't ask for help. When he was fully upright, he looked at the room. "The Sanz family seconds the motion," he said. Reyes stood. "Reyes family seconds." Sorrentino. "Seconded." Luca Caruso. Caruso seconds. The Marchetti delegate looked at Aldrich Voss. Then he looked away from Aldrich Voss, which was its own kind of answer, and said quietly, "Marchetti seconds." Voss's 4 men along the wall had moved slightly. Weight shifted, hands repositioned, the preparatory language of people recalculating whether the situation called for a different kind of response. Seraphine was aware of it. She was aware of Damien, standing behind her chair, who was also aware of it, whose eyes had moved to each of them in turn with the slow calm of a man who has made a decision and is at peace with its consequences. Voss looked at his men, and then he looked at the table, at the 9 votes sitting there, including 2 that had been his 12 hours ago, and at the 4 men along the wall who were the only remaining instrument his organization had in this room, and at the calculus of what deploying those 4 men would mean in front of assembled family leadership versus what walking away with the operation exposed and the leverage dissolved would mean. He was intelligent. That was the thing about him. The plan had been intelligent, and the execution had been disciplined, and the only thing it had failed to fully account for was the specific combination of people who were in this room and what they were willing to stand up for. He straightened his jacket. 48 hours, he said, and walked out. His 4 men followed. The room let out a collective breath that wasn't dramatic but was very real, the sound of pressure releasing from a space that had been holding too much of it. Seraphine sat down. She pressed her hands flat on the table and looked at the wood grain and breathed. Damien's hand found her shoulder. Brief. He didn't leave it there. He just placed it for a moment. The specific weight of a hand that had no agenda in this moment, except to mark that it was there, and then he removed it and stepped back. She didn't turn around, but she didn't move away from it either. The formal black table convened 2 days later at the Veltrano estate, in the room where it had always been held, under the chandeliers that had witnessed 40 years of covenant renewals. The Castellan group did not attend. Their operation in the United States was under federal scrutiny by then. The Philadelphia connection, once pulled, had unraveled a considerable amount of additional thread, and the men who had been running a quiet war of leverage and infiltration for 11 years found themselves with more immediate concerns than a mafia council vote. Aldrich Voss left the country on the morning of the second day. Tavio was turned over to federal custody through the same voluntary disclosure arrangement that had gutted Castellan's leverage. He went quietly, which surprised no one who had ever understood that he was fundamentally a professional, and professionalism in his specific line of work meant accepting the outcomes of failed operations without theater. Vivienne Cross was a more complicated matter. The charges that could be brought against her were real, but required building a case that would take time, and she had lawyers who were very good at buying that time. She left the estate on the morning after the Center Hall confrontation and was in a different country before the paperwork had been sorted. Seraphine did not chase her. She thought about what she had said at the Veltrano gates in the outline of a story she hadn't yet lived but had somehow known was coming. Power was never something you could wear. She let Vivienne go with the necklace she had worn for 2 days and the knowledge that 2 days was all it had amounted to. That seemed like enough. The formal vote at the black table was 9-2, with the Marchetti and one additional family abstaining rather than opposing. The covenant was renewed on its original terms. The Castellan restructuring proposal was rejected without extended debate, because there was nothing left to debate. The proposal had depended on leverage and momentum in a controlled environment, and all three had been removed. The question of Seraphine's formal role came from Benedetto, who raised it at the closing session with the deliberate quietness of a man who has been waiting for the right moment for a long time. The House of Valsieri has operated in this council for 4 decades without formal recognition, he said. It has been the foundation that prevented us from destroying each other on 3 separate occasions that I can count personally. He paused. I would like to move that we correct that. The motion was not unanimous. 2 families abstained and 1 objected on the grounds that formal recognition of a bloodline-based authority was a structural step the covenant hadn't been designed for. Seraphine did not argue with the objection. She didn't need to. The vote carried without her advocacy, which was precisely the way she had always preferred things to happen. She was not crowned. She found the word uncomfortable, its theater, its implication that authority was something conferred by gesture rather than demonstrated through action. What happened instead was simpler. The council formally acknowledged, in writing, that Seraphine Vale Moretti held recognized standing at the black table in her own right. Not as Damien's wife, not as a representative of the Moretti family. As herself, as the inheritor of the Valsieri covenant, the bloodline whose particular genius for making people trust each other had held this architecture together through 4 decades of pressure. She signed the document with her own name, Seraphine Vale, not Moretti. Damien was present when she signed. He watched her hand move through her maiden name, and he didn't say anything, which was the right response. There were things she might eventually say to him about what came next between them, about forgiveness and what it required and what it didn't, about the specific complicated territory of loving someone who had failed you and been failed by you in equal measure. Those conversations existed in the future, if she chose to have them, in the private space of 2 people working out what they were to each other after everything had changed. But not tonight. Tonight she folded the document into her coat. The Donna necklace had been recovered from the Moretti estate. Vivienne had left it behind. Apparently, when it came to actual departure, the necklace had not seemed as important as a passport and a go-bag. It sat now in a wooden box on the council table. Benedetto looked at it. He looked at Seraphine. She shook her head. "Put it in the vault," she said. He nodded like he'd expected that answer. She walked out of the Veltrano ballroom into the night air. The estate's exterior lights were on. casting warm, irregular light across the gravel and the old stonework. She could hear the council members dispersing, voices, engines, the polite goodbyes of people who have survived something together and are now figuring out how to be ordinary again. She walked to the edge of the property, to the low stone balustrade that looked out over the garden below. She stood there. She was tired in a way that went past the body, the specific exhaustion that comes after a sustained period of operating at the outer edge of your capacity, when the concentration and the planning and the managing of fear finally get to release, and what's left underneath is a person who hasn't slept properly in 3 days and who has permanently altered the landscape of everything she lives in. She thought about her grandmother, the woman in the photograph, 30 years old, sitting at the center of the table like she'd always been there. She had never known what that woman had felt walking out of that room, whether she'd been triumphant or frightened or simply exhausted in the same way Seraphine was exhausted now. Whether she'd stood somewhere in the night air after and let herself be, for a few minutes, just a person rather than a symbol. She supposed it didn't matter. The woman had done it anyway. Whatever she'd felt, she had done it. That was what women in this line did. Footsteps on the gravel behind her. She knew without turning that it was Benedetto. He came to stand beside her. He didn't speak for a while. They looked out at the dark garden together, two people who had known each other across a long stretch of complicated history and had arrived at a place where silence between them was comfortable rather than charged. "Your grandmother stood here once," he said finally, "after the original signing. I was 30 years old and I stood back there," he gestured vaguely behind them, "because I didn't think it was my place to approach her, and I watched her stand here for about 20 minutes, just looking out there." "Did you ever ask her what she was thinking about?" "Years later," he said. "She said she was thinking about whether it would hold, whether the thing they'd built would last." Seraphine looked at the garden. "Did she get an answer?" "She said she decided it would hold as long as the right people were willing to stand in the right places when it needed them." He paused. She seemed satisfied with that. She thought about it. Whether it would hold, she didn't know. She knew what she had built in the last 4 days from the ruins of a situation that had been designed to destroy her. She knew that the covenant had been renewed and the Castellan operation had been fractured and the leverage had been removed and the 4 families that had stood firm were still standing. She knew that somewhere in the architecture of what she had done were the bones of something durable, not because she was exceptional, but because she had understood the thing her grandmother had understood, which was that durability came from genuine relationships, not from spectacle or fear. Whether it would hold depended on all the people in it, including the ones who had failed this time and would have to be trusted to do better, including Damien, including herself. She couldn't know. She could only stand here. "Go home, Benedetto," she said. "Get some sleep." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Home," he said, like the word amused him gently. "Yes, I suppose there's that." She heard him turn and walk back across the gravel, slow and steady, the cane marking its particular rhythm against the stone. She stayed a while longer. The garden below was dark and bare and entirely ordinary. An old garden on old ground, keeping its own history in the way that places do. Quietly, without announcement, available only to the people who knew where to look and had the patience to look properly. She put her hand in her coat pocket and felt the folded document there. Her name on it. Her real name. The name she'd been born with and had carried underneath everything else for 19 years, waiting for the moment it would be the name that mattered most. She took one long breath of cold night air. Then she turned and walked back